Okay, so since we are close to the native soil of Pablo Picasso, I thought it would be fitting to start with one of his quotes in relation to my subject today. To arrive at abstraction, it is always necessary to begin with a concrete reality. And for me, that reality is a bit more complex than a relatively static content website. In fact, we use Sitecore for booking sites, web portals, and a variety of e-commerce solutions. So we tend to have a lot of integrations, are utilizing personalization rules, and aren't necessarily running on the latest Sitecore version as well. And we developers all know that whenever we see the opportunity to customize stuff, we'll dive in head first. So in order to be able to look at the bigger picture when it comes to migrating your Sitecore website to XM Cloud, I think it's necessary to unravel such an advanced implementation and see how to cope with all the different elements, see what's compatible and what isn't, and think about how you would approach a migration in such a scenario. And that's what we are going to do today. Oh, and by the way, that's not a Picasso, but it's generated by Midjourney. Might be a good thing to mention. My name is Rob Habrake. I'm a technology director and Sitecore MVP at I/O with over 15 years of experience in Sitecore development, and XM Cloud is a whole new exciting chapter for me. Let's first have a look at the major differences in setup, architecture, and mindset. So what makes XM Cloud different from Platform DXP? In a way, it's comparing apples to apples, but there are some important differences. First of all, obviously, we're coming from a DXP to what I call a powerhouse XM, because it does way more than you might expect from a regular CMS. You have an improved editing experience with Sitecore pages. You have all the SaaS benefits, but still the flexibility of a PaaS product, so you can deploy to it, and you have advanced configuration possibilities. And maybe the most important thing is that you don't build on top of it, but next to it. And I'll get to that in a bit. It's part of a Composable DXP, where integration is key, and we have a whole new development experience. So I won't dive too deep into the architecture, and you might have seen this already a few times during this conference, but for a basic understanding of the concepts in this talk, let's look at how the XM Cloud architecture is being set up. So you have two environments, and you immediately see that you have a less complex topology. You have a few containers, and that environment is provided to you by Sitecore. You can fork the repository, and you have your XM Cloud instance, and you, from your own repository, can deploy to either environment. On XM Cloud, you have your CM instance, your Edge, and Edge is actually an API to query against for content using GraphQL, but it also provides you with a CDN for your Sitecore media library. And then you have your rendering host, which is also called the editing host, because it's only used for the previewing and editing from pages and the experience editor. And of course, you have to self-provide your front end. And as you might have seen, there is no web database anymore. So you only have a core and a master. And that means that the publishing changed. I'm not sure if you can tell at the back of the room, but coming from Platform DXP, we used to publish from the master to the web database. And after that, your content got resolved. And now we do have XM Cloud, and you actually publish from your master to the Edge. And if you do that, you get a snapshot of your layout, and the items will be resolved at that time. And what that means for your solution, we'll look at that a little bit further on in my talk. So when we are going to compare architectures, and I don't mean comparing the architectures of Sitecore, but of our own implementations, we see some important differences. First, let's start with what I would typically see when you see a Platform DXP. And disclaimer, every solution is different, and you do not necessarily have to build it like this. But we often see that we layer on top of the Sitecore implementation, the Sitecore installation. And you can see there that we have renderings, we do have business logic, and we do have our data integrations. Because what we do is, and as I mentioned, we use it for booking sites, we use it for web portals, so we retrieve data from external systems. And our habit has been to do that from the implementation that we've built on top of Sitecore. So we actually retrieve, for example, catalog data and availability, and put that within our content resolver and send it out to the front end. So the front end just gets a mixed object of either static content or, well, Sitecore content and dynamic data coming from backend systems. We tend to do that within our Sitecore implementation, and that makes the development domain of indicated by the blue line. So you actually have your own React app or anything else if you use another front end with your Sitecore implementation, and your development domain actually includes the Sitecore installation. Things like visitor identification, tracking, and personalization also happens at the back end. And last but not least, we have a habit of customizing stuff, and we'll see what that means for migrating our solution to XM Cloud later on. So when you now look at XM Cloud, we actually see a change of perspective. And you could have always done it this way, but now you kind of have to. We see a better separation of concern. Sitecore is positioned more as a content provider, as a service like any other in your application landscape. And what you want to do, you want to push all the integrations and functionality to your front end, to your head. Sitecore is used to push the layout, which resolves upon, based on your URL, and you can query for additional content from your Next.js app. And what you want to do is you want to move those integrations of your services to, for example, microservices, and be able to retrieve the data from your front end. We'll see why it isn't longer possible for some scenarios to do that going to Sitecore. Obviously, we do not have a CD anymore. So that changes our architecture. And it also means that things like personalization and all other integrations actually need to move to your head, and your development domain kind of shifts. So you see a shift in ownership. Obviously, we're still able to deploy to Sitecore. We have to push our project to it and our renderings and our content. But any custom integrations are moved to your own development domain. This also, for example, goes for your security. If you want to use security to secure certain pages for a specific audience, you can't do that based of the security model in Sitecore anymore because it's not exposed via the CD as it was before. So you need to do that on your front end. And it actually allows for better maintainability and a clear architecture, in my opinion. So due to this different architecture and XM being a subset of XP, not everything is going to be compatible. Or not everything can be persisted when you migrate to XM Cloud. And this actually kind of dictates how your migration path is going to look like. I know this has been shared before, so I'll go over it briefly only. But the things, functionality-wise, that are not compatible with XM Cloud are XConnect and everything related to marketing applications. So you might want to replace that with Sitecore Personalized and or CDP, depending on the functionality you use. Your existing personalization rules can also be replaced by personalized, but it depends on how complex they are, if you can do that out of the box with XM Cloud, or if you want to have the product Sitecore Personalized, because XM Cloud does allow you to use the exact same technology for basic personalization and in-session personalization. The email experience manager is going to be replaced by Sitecore Send, and Sitecore Forms, well, I said third-party product, but we all have seen that we now have a nice promise of looking forward to do Sitecore Forms on XM Cloud as well in the near future. So that slide is already outdated within this conference. Sitecore identity is going to be replaced by a unified identity, and that is only used for your login between the different composable products. As I said, you can't use it at the front end anymore, so if you base your security implementation on it, you actually want to do that on the front end as well. What you can do, for example, is you can embed certain authorization elements within your content and send that to the front end. So if you implement your AD implementation or any other IDP, you can retrieve claims, for example, and then based on that, use a GraphQL query to query for specific content based on that authorization model. Technically, there are also differences, and well, there's a lot of obvious stuff in there. As you say, with MVC is replaced with GSS, and obviously MVC renderings are, and again, we've heard some promises by David Flanagan that might change in the future as well, but as for now, you only have your GSS renderings, which is, I think it's a great product. But the Sitecore search also changed. So you do not any longer have the SXA search components, and you can't create your custom search indexes because there's no web index. You can't build your own custom index to the web database. And Solar, which is shipped within the container, is used for CM only. So you can do two things to replace that. You can replace it by GraphQL queries for the basic needs, and I'll have some examples of that later on. Or you might want to replace it for crawling, for example, with Sitecore Search or a similar product. If you want to do things like retrieving items of a specific type, like news items, and you want to filter those or you want to query those, that can be perfectly done with GraphQL. If you want to have crawling capabilities, you want to look for a more SaaS-like product like Sitecore Search. And a very good thing, Sitecore Publishing Service is no longer available because, well, it doesn't fit the current architecture, but the built-in publishing works just fine. And you no longer have an update center because Sitecore will keep your instance up to date. And that even goes for your local environment. So the funny thing is you have your containers and Sitecore updates the container registry with your containers. So if you work on it, you automatically get your new containers. And I already experienced this when working with it in the past few months, that I see changes coming in automatically, and I think it's great. So to summarize, for your basic personalization or analytics, you're good. Only thing is you have to re-implement them because the configuration is not compatible with the current DXP implementation. Advanced personalization or any marketing automation related stuff, you might want to redesign based on Sitecore Personalized and CDP. Your search functionality is going to be replaced by Sitecore Search, or as I mentioned, GraphQL for the basic needs, EXM by Send, MVC by GSS, and anything publishing, deploying, or updating related, XM Cloud will take care of that. So as I said, this dictates what your migration path is going to look like. If you're utilizing a lot of XP functionality, you need to carve them out first. And from a composable point of view, that's perfectly possible on your current implementation. So actually, before starting the migration itself, and how would you go about that? I designed a process, and it's just a suggestion for you how I would approach this on migrating an existing DXP implementation going forward to XM Cloud. And I will dive deeper in those steps on the next slides. But to give you an overview, you first start with an assessment with a gap analysis and a breakdown of all the functionality. Then you start preparing your solution, carving out the things that are not compatible, moving them to another product on your current solution. And the next step is to rework your front end. And this heavily differs between already being on GSS or already being on SXA with GSS, or if you are still on MVC renderings, obviously. And the last step is actually to perform your migration. where you set up your new implementation and start moving over your content. And I think that the complexity, and I draw an imaginary curve over this to show you, that I think the complexity and the impact and the workload over time is mostly around transforming your architecture and maybe, depending on your solution, transforming your front end. I think if you've done that correctly, the actual migration isn't going to be that hard. So diving deeper into those steps, your first step is the assessment, taking inventory. What are your customizations on your CMS, like custom fields, like utilizing security, maybe content resolvers, or even render pipelines that you have? Do you have any specific integrations, and where are they embedded in your solution? Which personalization rules do you use, etc.? Because what I said, well, I'll get to that in the next slide. The gap analysis. Which Sitecore version are you on? Do you need to upgrade, or do you leverage a lot of XP functionality or not? And are you using GSS already? I think you need to carefully consider all those steps and then plan out a migration path to isolate and refactor the components in preparation to the actual migration. The next step is preparation, or maybe isolation and refactoring. And here you're going to transform your architecture. And as you see below, it's a bit small at the back, I know, but the renderings, the business logic, and the data integrations in your current implementations need to move. Only your renderings stay, and you want to move your integrations, ideally in a more MACH-like architecture, to microservices and connect to them from the front end. And I would actually advise you to do this before you upgrade to Sitecore 10 if you need to, or 10.3 if you need to. Because, for example, if you have a current solution with a crawling search based on Solr, which is custom and embedded in your implementation, if you're going to upgrade your solution to 10, you also need to upgrade that functionality. If you carve it out first and you replace it, and you can perfectly, that's the beauty of composable, you can perfectly replace that by, for example, Sitecore search, and remove your own Solr crawling implementation and your indexes and stuff. This leans out your implementation, makes the upgrade to 10 easier, and going forward, the migration to XM Cloud. Then you're going to rework your front end. You need to drop your custom rendering pipelines, and you need to take a look at your custom content resolvers. And this is a heavy one. I'll have a chapter on that later on. You need to really determine the purpose and rethink or redesign using the GraphQL queries that you have, but you might be able to keep them. And depending on the delta, you need to develop new renderings or rework them. You can either use the GSS or the ASP.NET Rendering SDK if you like. And lastly, last but not least, keeping your renderings is perfectly possible if you are already on headless. So that didn't really change at all. The last step of the migration is setting up a new solution. You start with setting up a new solution based on for example, well, that's actually my preference. Do not do it via the wizard, but set up a new solution, forking the XM Cloud Foundation Head repository, update the NuGet packages within your solution, and then update, these are all the default steps and they are well documented. Update the build configuration in the XM Cloud build JSON, configure your item serialization. That's actually those you want to embed as resources. Configure the projects that you want to build and your rendering or editing hosts, because that's what's included in XM Cloud, not your actual rendering, because that's in your front end, and any XDT transformation that you require. And then you configure the Sitecore content serialization modules, the ones that aren't resources, but just your content that you might want to synchronize between the different environments and start migrating your content. After which, you can reapply the personalization rules. And obviously, it's easy for me to say this as small steps, but they all take some planning, and you might even want to, for example, when you, by the way, migrate your content, you might want to leverage the authoring API, because Edge also has an authoring API, so you can maybe automate the migration process of your content coming from your current implementation going into XM Cloud. And you need to design and implement new CI/CD pipelines. I think you want to have multiple pipelines for multiple processes. So you want to be able to synchronize content. If you need to, you want to push the renderings, and you might want to push the business logic of your microservices and the foundation of Sitecore, and maybe you even get 4 separate pipelines. But, well, that's something I'll have to further dive into myself as well. What's the ideal setup? But anyhow, we get a new development experience. And the development experience is going to improve a lot. I think onboarding is a blast now with those containers. No setting up Sitecore anymore, way less configuration, and also the deployments are easier. But there's also a little bit of a challenge to get front-end and back-end work together efficiently in a proper workflow, I think. And you also have to change your mindset when it comes to customizing and when it comes to querying data. So that's one thing I want to have a look at as well as part of the migration process. First, let's have a look at the workflow. Mocking and this working contract first isn't really an option anymore, since when choosing GraphQL as a query method, the disconnected mode is not supported. So you also see a shift towards the front end and responsibilities of querying data in Graph, for example, and also the business logic will be pushed towards your front end. So your front end will get more complex in a way. So the workflow is an important aspect of your new project setup. You have basically, well, I think you have a number of options to work on XM Cloud. The first one is fully local, where this is kind of the default one. You check out the repository, you run your containers locally, and you can just very easily change your renderings on your machine. They will get hot reloaded into your container. You can sync your content with Sitecore content serialization, and you can deploy to it just as you can deploy to XM Cloud. But this is mostly targeted at backend developers, because you need to be able to, you need to run on a Windows machine to be able to run those containers. And you also have the downside of not being able to work in Sitecore pages without deploying.
That's actually, they have a new documentation for that.
Mm-hmm.
You can change some settings in your developer console,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can run pages on your local.
Yeah, I know. I'll get to that. The second thing you can do is you can use Edge mode, which is I think mostly targeted at front-end developers, and you can run your head locally against your experience Edge. And Sebastian has a nice video on how to do this. It's only a few minutes to set up, and it's very easy to work like this. Though, if you look at this scenario, I think looking at the workflow, there's a dependency on your backend developers, because your backend developers have to prepare your items and your renderings to a certain extent, and you also want to push this via a CI/CD pipeline. So you can edit the templates on XM Cloud directly, but I would advise against it. You do have your non-production environments, and this is just a preference. You can do it any way you like. You can create a test and an acceptance environment, but you can also create a deployment environment. And if you have a development environment on it, so you can work on it and pull your content from there. But you have to carefully design the process. And the third option is hybrid mode, and there's multiple ways of doing this. Serge van den Oever has a nice blog post on it, be sure to check it out. What you can do is you can develop locally and configure actually use the what's called the external editing host in Pages, pointing towards a reverse proxy. So you can actually use your local renderings to update things in XM Cloud. But in this scenario, you have to create a development environment within XM Cloud and then create a website for each developer, because obviously a rendering host is targeted to a specific machine. But in that way, either being a front-end developer or a back-end developer, you can work with your local rendering host or Next.js dev server to actually update your renderings and see the changes in XM Cloud directly. And as you already mentioned,
Well, actually, this is like the Sitecore way, right? There's also an official Sitecore way without a reverse proxy.
yeah, there is actually, yes. So I think there's some benefits of either way. And what it really says is that you need to, well, you can use that one, but what you need to have to look at, and I'll jump forward to this, you have to think about your workflow when you're going to migrate to XM Cloud. Because if you want to set up a proper deploy CI/CD pipeline of your code and of your renderings and work with different people, you have a dependency on each other, and you want to create those steps. And what you do want to do is you want to have you don't want to have a deployment for each change. So what the method of Serge does, and which I like, but I still have to find my preferred way myself, because there's downsides and upsides of all of them. But the upside of that is that you don't have to deploy in between the steps. But what you also see, I think we're going to XM Cloud, is to actually have a more, well, maybe you see a shift in roles. I here named it a backend developer and a front-end developer. But I think we're moving from that more traditional approach to maybe different roles, like maybe you get a Sitecore specialist that focuses on templates and XM Cloud and on the GraphQL model, transforming it to another model for the front end, and then you have your front enders working with that output, and your back enders might shift toward more your C# developers or anything shift towards more of the microservices approach. And there you also see this separation of concern in your architecture translating to your roles and to your workflow. The last thing I want to share with you is custom content resolvers, because I think this is the biggest impact on your migration process. We use custom content resolvers for a lot of different scenarios, and I'm going to show you a few. But the first question is, can we still use custom content resolvers? Well, the short answer is yes. But there's a change in content resolver, well, actually the place where content is being resolved. So as I showed you in the publishing change, the content is no longer resolved at request time, but at publish time. And that actually means that your content resolver is not impacted by a cache invalidation. But it also means you can't dynamically render content. So if you want to do dynamic data retrieval, it's no longer possible. If you, for example, I gave you the example of, for a booking site, the availability, retrieving that, putting that in your custom content resolver, pushing that forward to the front end, you can't do that anymore, because the output living on the edge is more or less static. You do obviously have you have multiple variations for your personalization, for example, but the output is somewhat static. So should you still use the content resolvers or the custom content resolvers? Well, I think in general it's a good idea to break the habit of customizing your content resolvers for everything. And I've seen projects, and we also have projects where we kind of, as a default, start thinking about how can we help front-enders to make the output more ideal and always change stuff in every for every content resolver or every different template or output. And I think it's a good idea to break with this habit because it shrinks your functionality footprint and the amount of code. And so it also increases the maintainability. And given the nature and given the changed nature of the resolving process, you cannot resolve content dynamically any longer. So in some cases you do have to. So you have two choices. Either you transfer your custom content resolvers, but only if they're static, because they still work, and I've tested it out, it works fine. Or you can restructure your content. And that's basically sometimes also what we do in a custom content resolver, but now not in the content resolver, but in the actual content itself. And that way you have less functionality, less code to test and maintain. And I won't go into detail what the actual options are, but you do have a number of resolvers, like the data source, the context items, and both have an item children resolver. And you also have the filter resolver that you can use to filter through the sentence. So why did we use them? Well, first of all, maybe initially because this was also advertised in the Sitecore documentation as a way to customize your data model. But I browsed through a number of projects and found a few cases, like changing field names, simplifying the data model for the front end, restructure your content, like combining items or changing the hierarchy, but also reordering content, and, as I mentioned, including dynamic data, or performing additional operations. And if you then look at how this translates to XM Cloud, you will see that some things are still possible and some aren't. Like including dynamic data and performing additional operations is no longer possible. The other ones still are possible, but you might want to reconsider changing them either to GraphQL queries or restructuring your content. So let's have a look at a few examples. I actually kind of hoped for a bit of a bigger screen when I made this slide, so I hope it's somewhat readable in the back. In a way, it's still pseudocode anyway, because, well, I cut out this of a number of different projects I encountered and just had a look at, okay, if I have to inventorize which custom content resolvers we have, what happens in those things? Well, this is a very nice one, because in this one we have wildcard pages, and the developer thought, well, I want to count the number of visits on this wildcard page, so why not put it in the content resolver that each time I retrieve content, it automatically increases the counter, which is, well, efficient in a way, but that's no longer possible. So you do have to split this kind of logic into a separate microservice, and you have to call it from the front end. By the way, this specific code is very XP and XConnect or DXP focused anyway, so you need to redesign this to CDP anyway. This one, I found one where we parameterized a button. So we changed maybe the function of a button or the text on a button or stuff like that. You can't do that anymore because you can't work with the query parameters. So what you need to do is you move this towards the head and implement such business logic in the front end. Maybe that one we all know, which is an actual Sitecore example from the documentation. And I've included it because I think it's funny, because this one actually still does work. But the outcome now, and it's not from the XM Cloud documentation, don't get me wrong, it's from the earlier instructions on how to customize content resolvers. This actually works, but the date time.now will always be the publish date. So that makes you see when things when things happen in the process of publishing. And one last one, the breadcrumbs. We have a project, and this is not all of the code, where we go over all of the items leading up to this one, and then build up a breadcrumb and give it back within the content resolver. This actually still works, and you can keep it if you like. But I think there's also an easier way, and that is using GraphQL for this. You can easily retrieve the ancestors of a specific item, and you can also do things like filtering on the navigable pages or filtering on a specific data template. And if you do it like this, you see that you end up with less code. You don't have the C# code that you need to deploy to your Sitecore implementation. It's easier to maintain, and it's just a smaller footprint. So I think it's a good example of what you can do when you build up your pages when going to XM Cloud. And if you look at the GraphQL queries, you have a few more options. You can use it for filtering of facets. For example, if you want to retrieve items of a specific category, or if you want to search on field values. Let's say we have news items and we want to browse through the title and find every title that has the word cloud in it. That sort of things are perfectly possible with GraphQL. It has its limitations too, because it doesn't support recursive queries. And if you go towards a more, well, maybe crawling kind of functionality, you want to go to a search product. And if you have more complex kind of resolver-based needs, you might still want to create a custom content resolver. But that should be like an exception to the default way of working. So what have we learned about migrating or changing our solution when migrating to XM Cloud? Well, the general approach is that you first move out your customizations and isolate your business logic into microservices and then transfer them to the front end. And I think this would can be perfectly described as carving out your current solution and making it composable already. Then you need to revision your content structure and your content resolving, and change your GSS renderings to migrate to those new content resolving and eventually also migrate the actual content. And if your delta is too big, you might want to opt for a gradual transition, maybe of a hybrid solution. And if you're interested in that, you can visit the next talk in this room from Bart Plasmeijer, who is going to talk about that topic. So why should you invest in moving towards XM Cloud? Well, I think when you do so, you end up with a better architecture, a better overall architecture. You have a higher level of separation, and you have easier future integrations, and you actually have a shift in development domain, making it, well, easier to work with for your developers, because you have control over everything you do, and you isolate your work from the actual Sitecore implementation. And the obvious one, but a great one, you have less maintenance and no upgrades anymore, so more business value. So in the greater scheme of things, it really helps your project move forward and be more innovative, more valuable, and it's a great accelerator in many ways in that regard. Thanks for your attention. Are there any questions within the audience? You can also just talk to me in a hallway if you like, if you have a very specific question or if you want to brainstorm about anything.
Is there anything that's been announced at the conference, for example, with David Flanagan's keynote, that really stands out for the users, maybe changing the paradigm of, say, the functionality gap or anything like that?
Yeah, well, the remark about maybe reintroducing MVC again would definitely change your migration path, make it easier. I myself, I'm quite a fan of GSS anyway, so we see that in the past few years we already have been moving MVC to GSS. So for us that wouldn't change a lot, but I think for a lot of customers the delta would be way less big, and it would be less like a hurdle to move towards XM Cloud. Yeah.